Welcome back to today's video. Today is Sunday, August 4th, 2024, and today we are going to be taking a look at a 2024 presidential election prediction with Vice President Kamala Harris and Governor Tim Walz as her potential running mate against former President Donald Trump and Senator J.D. Vance, who has already been named as Donald Trump's running mate this election cycle. Now, I've already made two videos talking about hypothetical VP nominees, and as the Veep stakes seem to narrow down to three primary contenders, Governor Tim Walz, Governor Josh Shapiro, and Senator Mark Kelly, I only felt it was fitting to now do a third iteration of this prediction. I will be trying to release one sometime tomorrow. In the event that Kamala Harris announces her VP tomorrow, I probably will not, but that will include Governor Andy Beshear, who seems to be the last one holding out to be the main contender, the top four main contenders for the Veep stakes this cycle. But Tim Walz, I think, came into conversation more recently today and the past few days as a strong alternative in the Rust Belt. Governor Andy Beshear comes from Kentucky, Senator Mark Kelly comes from Arizona, and some Democrats seem to have some levels of concerns around Governor Josh Shapiro in the state of Pennsylvania, though there are many political analysts out there who do say that Josh Shapiro is likely Kamala Harris's best bet, including Nate Silver, who published an article today titled that she should pick Josh Shapiro. So Tim Walz, I think, really comes in at a unique intersection of being a Midwestern governor from the state of Minnesota, has had relatively strong election performances, and also just has a relatively high approval rating in comparison to many other governors, and specifically compared to many other Democratic governors across the United States. Now, at baseline, Kamala Harris and Tim Walz are not going to lose any states that Biden won back in 2020 in the safe category. There's not going to be any massive resurgence of Republican support in some of these states that might have historically been more conservative. Democrats are pretty locked in some of these states, and Republicans really, aren't, right? And Republicans, of course, have their own states that they can count on as safe states like Kansas and Missouri and Alabama. And so, forgive the mischaracterization in Georgia for just a moment, but we really narrow up to these 125 electoral votes that we routinely call to be safe Republican states. Now, it leaves us with roughly 232 electoral votes that are competitive. Democrats, I will say, have absolutely believed that they can narrow down this map a little bit further. There have been arguments to be made that Kamala Harris could narrow up a state like South Carolina and Mississippi under 15%, but in reality, that's not changing really anything about our electoral map, and I wouldn't spend too much time talking about that or really even discussing it. I think what we have found is that these states have voted the same way since the beginning of the 21st century for a reason, with very minimal exceptions. States like Indiana are in the exception column here. Regardless, though, these states really have yet to deviate and probably won't for the remainder of the next coming election cycles. So Kamala Harris, Tim Walz, 181, Donald Trump, J.D. Vance, 125. No surprise here. What I want to do is go ahead and continue characterizing some of our likely states. Not wasting any time here. Minnesota, Tim Walz's state, easily going to go to a Kamala Harris, Tim Walz ticket. The good news for Kamala Harris is that with or without him, she wins the state of Minnesota. Hillary Clinton won the state by 1.5. Biden went on to win by 7. And now Survey USA, which is one of the state's top pollsters, now says that Kamala Harris is ahead by 10. And so that's without Tim Walz. I imagine that with him on the ticket, it would make it an 11, 12-point margin here. Not enough to make it a safe state, but Minnesota absolutely would be very solid for Kamala Harris. And the effects across the Rust Belt will be seen later on in the video. Donald Trump, however, has his own set of likely states. We're not done with the Democratic states, but we are going to go ahead and characterize some likely Republican states just for the sake of averaging out the map. Right now, they're down nearly 100 electoral votes. And so these include states like Ohio and Florida and Iowa, 3 states that moved away from the Obama 2012 column in 2016 and haven't gone back. In races in 2018, 2020, 2022, and of course, as I'm predicting in 2024, these states have become far more conservative than Democrats would have liked, and while historically may have been more competitive, are far, far, far more out in the right-wing column than I think many Democrats had been hoping for. And honestly speaking, Donald Trump and J.D. Vance should not have any trouble winning these battleground states that aren't even really battleground states anymore. So Ohio, Iowa, Florida, totaling up to 53 electoral votes. That brings Donald Trump and J.D. Vance to 178. These states were very solid back in 2020. Only expect them to be solid in 2024, regardless of who the VP nominee is going to be. So now let's go ahead and continue. The Democrats have their own, again, fair share of likely states as well. Colorado, New Mexico, 2 states that we saw Biden do very well in back in 2020. One Colorado by 13.5, one New Mexico by 10. Reasonably thinking, these states aren't going to shift much. Kamala Harris might lose some support amongst different groups, minority groups. We might see some narrow shifting, a few points, 3 to 4 to 5 points to the right comparison to 2020. However, These states are still pretty solid for the Democratic Party. No real massive movements enough to take them out of the likely Democratic column, especially given that Biden built up such a large margin that Kamala Harris has a lot of room to fall before she even comes close to losing the state. Virginia is another state I would characterize as a likely Democratic state, a 10.1% margin back in 2020. I expect her with Tim Walz to do equally as well. The Northern Virginia community has only become more and more Democratic over the past two cycles, the off-year cycle and, of course, the midterm election cycle. Virginia right now is a pretty strong Democratic state. Even with Glenn Youngkin, unless he was on the ticket himself, this state is likely blue. So that brings us to 219 electoral votes for Kamala Harris and Tim Walz, where I do think you would find Tim Walz doing a massive service for Kamala Harris, is specifically amongst white working class voters and just in general amongst white voters. I think Tim Walz really has shown that in Minnesota specifically, he can appeal to multiple different types of regions across the country, multiple different types of regions specific to the state as well that are exemplified in our results in 2018 when he first ran for governor in the state. He won by roughly 11 points across the state. Keep in mind, Hillary Clinton had only won by 1.5, and so his margin of victory was quite substantive. And when you take a look, too, at the areas in which he used to represent in the House of Representatives before he ran for governor, when you're taking a look at Tim Walz's district here, in Minnesota's 1st District, he won here by 1 point in 2016. Now, 1 point doesn't seem that impressive, but take a look at 2020. In 2020, the Republicans won it by 3.1%. In a difference, you saw that Tim Walz was doing very well. But here's the even more important fact. In this district specifically, Donald Trump won it in 2016. He also won it in 2020. Donald Trump has shown us that he can do well in some of these down ballot districts, and Minnesota's 1st is no different. By the time we got to 2022, the district became 12 points Republican. Very strong for the GOP. Tim Walz had held out strong in many cycles, including the 2014 midterm elections, where Donald Trump may not have been on the ballot and may not have been a mainstream political figure, but was a very strong year for Republicans statewide and nationwide. Minnesota was no exception. And so now Tim Walz being thrown back on this ticket. Someone who was elected in a Trump district, someone who had outperformed Hillary Clinton and also reasonably outperformed Joe Biden back in 2022. The circumstances of the state weren't as conducive to a victory of Tim Walz's stature back in 2018, but it was conducive to what he ended up getting. Winning by roughly 7 points statewide is very impressive, in my opinion, given that the year was meant to be a red wave year and there was not many levels of investment into this individual battleground state. Tim Walz did well with what he was dealt with, and arguably speaking, comes in with a really high level of approval in his home state alone. What we also find, again, in terms of regional advantage, Tim Walz was able to appeal to suburban voters, rural voters, urban voters, and that's why he was able to win in Minnesota by 11 points when he was first elected. That's why he was able to win in a Trump district in 2016. These things matter, and they translate to down ballot effects that can benefit the Democratic Party. In Minnesota, that very well could be the case. So that brings, again, us to 219. I think that we would find that Maine at large would be a likely Democratic state. New Hampshire would be a likely Democratic state. And so we're roughly around 225. Now, a big state that is yet to be characterized is the state of Texas. This is a state that Donald Trump is going to win, but I expect the margins to be quite narrow, right? I think, Donald Trump, J.D. Vance aren't going to win the state by 9 points like they did in 2016. They're not even going to win it by 5.6 like they did in 2020. But fundamentally, it is a Republican state. Democrats and Kamala Harris's campaign have made it clear they're not investing in it in the same way. I would say that these states, Texas included, are going to be pretty fine for the Republican Party, but narrowing down shows that in future elections can absolutely be far more competitive than what they might be this election cycle. And so really this brings us down. We can characterize Maine second and Nebraska second. These ones are going to go likely blue in Nebraska second, likely red in Maine second. That's how they've gone in the past cycle. Will not be changing much this election either. That brings us down to the the same seven toss-up states that the Democratic and Republican parties have been fighting for in 2020 and now again in 2024. The Kamala Harris for President campaign has made it very clear. These 7 states and these 93 electoral votes are where they are spending most of their money, most of their time, most of their resources, whatever it might be. On the contrary, Donald Trump's team acknowledges all of these 7, but also wants to fight elsewhere, also wants to be making a play for some other portions of the country, areas like Minnesota and Virginia and New Jersey. And I will say, if Tim Walz is on that ticket, Minnesota is not going to be within contention, and I can imagine Trump's campaign staff will be closing all of their campaign offices in Minnesota. So Trump's team expands a little bit further beyond this map, but it is very clear in where they're visiting, how they're doing their money, that the Kamala Harris campaign is focusing on these 7 battleground states. Tim Walz seems to help in a good chunk of them, specifically in the Rust Belt region. Now, I expect Kamala Harris and Donald Trump to perform roughly similar to how I would expect them and how I did predict them to do on their own in these battleground states like Georgia and North Carolina. I think Donald Trump will have the upper hand in these battleground states as of right now, but I could fully imagine a circumstance in which the election gets better for the Democratic Party, the election gets better for Kamala Harris, that by the time we reach November, North Carolina is on the verge of flipping, and Georgia might have already flipped. And so while that is all speculative and, relies on far more polling data and far more understanding of the state's dynamics in this cycle, I will say right now, I'm looking at this and saying, I think North Carolina and Georgia are going to be narrow Trump states, but I could very reasonably see them become Democratic states in this election cycle. I really wouldn't be shocked. But it does bring Donald Trump and J.D. Vance far closer to the presidency than some people might believe. Donald Trump and J.D. Vance at baseline have a very strong chance regardless of who the Democratic contender is, including the VP nominee. A lot of what we've seen here is that Kamala Harris is leading this ticket, and for 90% of this, that is who is going to be driving up turnout, driving out voters. The VP is only, if anything, a marginal add. In Georgia and North Carolina, it isn't enough to push her over the finish line. In Arizona and Nevada, because we're not talking about home state advantage, I don't really think we're seeing much change there either. I would say Nevada narrowly goes to Kamala Harris. In recent numbers, I think I would actually move it over to a lean Democratic column, but Arizona would still be a narrow Republican state. Those 11 electoral votes bring Donald Trump and J.D. Vance pretty close to winning the presidency, but not perfectly there. The remaining 44 toss-up electoral votes, I think Tim Walz would probably add the most in terms of any candidate that we've assessed thus far in VP candidacy for these states. While Josh Shapiro may have been able to deliver Pennsylvania in a way that was, lean blue on the verge of being likely, I still think Tim Walz can bring it. I think we'd still see it by a lean margin, 1 or 2 points, which is good for the Democratic Party. Another thing that I think would be good is the fact that Tim Walz is fine on labor relations. Voters like him in these battleground states, and in neighboring Wisconsin, I would also say a lean Democratic state. The final state to be characterized is the state of Michigan, where I would also agree that it shares a similar characterization to that of Wisconsin and Pennsylvania of being lean blue, giving Governor Tim Walz the best showing yet for a VP nominee to the presidency as of right now. Mark Kelly, I think, one electoral vote ahead, but on margin, Tim Walz does better. And so I think this is why we've seen a lot of push from members of the left, a big push rather, from members of the left for Governor Tim Walz to be Vice President Harris's VP. Because he provides a level of electability that may not be a slam dunk in Pennsylvania and may require more investment and more resources and more campaigning compared to Governor Josh Shapiro, but more security and more electability in areas like Wisconsin and Michigan. And while I do think that Josh Shapiro absolutely would perform very similarly, there are risks involving a newly elected governor, someone who had only been in office for 2 years and hasn't been vetted on the national level. Governor Tim Walz has been in Congress. Governor Josh Shapiro was not. Governor Tim Walz was elected in 2018. Governor Josh Shapiro was not. And to the point of Mark Kelly, while he may have been providing the state of Arizona narrowly across the finish line, we did start to see some things falling behind in the Rust Belt. If the Democratic Party is true to what they had said very early on in this election cycle, that their focus is solely on the Rust Belt, it seems as if this pathway forward may be one of the stronger pathways forward for Kamala Harris. But again, all of these VP nominees come in at a very strong position. Every single Democratic contender for VP, Governor Josh Shapiro, Senator Mark Kelly, Governor Tim Walz, Governor Andy Beshear, all of them have pros and cons. And for the most part, it is almost entirely pros. The Democratic Party is in a strong position right now. They have really strong VP candidates that could add on to Kamala Harris's momentum, add on to Kamala Harris's electability, that could do very good at a VP debate, at the convention, at rallies, could hold their own, could stand their ground. These are the qualities Kamala Harris seems to be looking for. Someone who can accompany her on the campaign trail, who can be a very strong surrogate for her as well as an advocate for themselves. That's what she's looking for in this cycle. And Governor Tim Walz could very well be that. So here we are, 276 electoral votes for Vice President Kamala Harris with Governor Tim Walz as her running mate, 262 electoral votes for former President Donald Trump and Senator J.D. Vance as his running mate. A very close election and very similar to the map that I released earlier on of Kamala Harris on her own. But when it comes down to security and getting narrowly past that margin and just slightly above what Democrats need to win, Governor Tim Walz, alongside many other VP contenders, can absolutely do that. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left, top left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch and then a playlist for my 2024 election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all tomorrow.